For all the strange tales you can find in media today, it's often the case that the most bizarre stories take place in reality. From the terminally hungry to a death-defying sexagenarian. In this compilation, we explore these curious happenings and more. We often like to keep mementos of those who mean a lot to us. Often, photos or a treasured item is enough to keep our memories fresh. In our first episode, however, we explore 5 cases in which nothing short of a body part would suffice. Albert Einstein was one of, if not the most famous scientist of the 20th century. His theory of relativity transforming astronomy and theoretical physics forever. A genius like that must have had some brain. I say had, not only due to him having passed away, but also because it no longer resides with his body, as it was removed just hours after his death and studied. This wasn't an uncommon occurrence when those with exceptional minds passed away. Slightly less common is for eyes to also be taken, but that is exactly what happened. So, why his eyes? Did they think that maybe they held the key to his intelligence? In a word, no. Thomas Harvey, the pathologist at the hospital where he passed away, was the man who performed an illegal autopsy on the deceased Einstein, though he then managed to receive a retroactive blessing from Einstein's son, Hans. The brain was removed, dissected and placed in some 200 or so slides for study, though it's uncertain this ever happened, as Harvey seemed to keep them laying around as some sort of morbid trinket, which leads us to the eyes. They were removed and given as a gift to Einstein's eye doctor and friend, Henry Abrams. He was once quoted as saying, "Einstein was a very important part of my life, a lasting influence. Having his eyes means the professor's life has not ended. A part of him is still with me." The eyes currently reside in a safety deposit box somewhere in New York City. After the brain, the second most popular body part to be taken post-mortem seems to be the male genitalia. Famous thingies to have been removed include that of Rasputin the Mad Monk and Napoleon Bonaparte, who was buried apart from his bone. Yeah. It's said that Napoleon's doctor Francesco Otomarchi cut it off in front of 17 witnesses during his autopsy. It was then given to priest Abbe Agnès Paul Vignali, who had given him his last rites. It then became a bit of a family heirloom as it was passed down through the generations. It eventually found its way into the hands of an American rare books dealer in 1924, going on display at the Museum of French Art in New York in 1927. New York seems to be the place to go for famous body parts, it seems. It's said that no pictures exist of the item. This may be due to the fact it was poorly preserved and is said to look like a shriveled eel or a piece of leather. Its current owner is Evan Latimer, who inherited it from her father, who had purchased the phallic fossil for $3,000. It's said she has received offers of over $100,000 for the item since then, and that's some pricey jerky. Galileo Galilei was, once again, a genius physicist, engineer and astronomer, but it wasn't his eyes or brain that were preserved. In fact, he managed to make it to his grave almost fully intact. It remained that way for almost 100 years until in 1737 his body was exhumed so as to be moved to a new tomb opposite that of fellow Italian genius Michelangelo. Fans, or perhaps those sensing the chance to grab a macabre souvenir, seized upon the opportunity, making away with several fingers, a tooth and a single vertebra. One of the digits ended up at the Museum of Science and History in Florence, with the other curious keepsakes residing with the family who managed to lose them. Well done. They were eventually found in 2009 and reunited, not with the rest of his body, but with the finger inside the museum in Florence, where they remain on display. Whether the other parts orbit the middle finger, we couldn't say. You might not be surprised to find that Mary Shelley, the famous author of the Frankenstein novel, would have a morbid keepsake to remember her late husband by. Percy Bysshe Shelley was a progressive thinker and major proponent of the English Romantic poetry scene in the early 1800s. At 21 and already married to another woman, he and Mary ran away to the continent, and on their return, his then wife, Harriet Westbrook, committed suicide by jumping into the Serpentine. He would then go on to marry Mary, though he continued to have a wandering eye. The pair were early advocates of free love, though Mary only had eyes for Percy. In July 1822, Percy drowned when his sailboat was lost in a storm. When his body was found 10 days later, a funeral pyre was erected and his body was cremated. In attendance were his good friends Edward Trelawney and Leigh Hunt. As his body burned, Trelawney noticed that his heart was not burning. Reaching into the pyre, he pulled it from the flames and gave it to Hunt. Despite wanting to keep it himself, Hunt eventually passed the heart on to Mary, who kept it in a silken shroud. Despite his wandering eye, it would be she who would have his heart forevermore. After her death, the heart was eventually buried in the family vault. Chief Mavanyunyika was, as the title suggests, the chief of a tribe of people known as the Hihi, and during the 1890s he led them into a battle against the German colonial machine in what is now modern-day Tanzania. One of his greatest victories came against German Commissioner Emil von Zalewski, who led a battalion of soldiers to suppress the tribe. Mkwawa and his warriors, armed with mostly spears and a few guns, managed to overpower the German force, with Zalewski losing the battle and his life. Eventually, the German forces managed to take the Hihi fortress, but Mkwawa escaped and continued to conduct a campaign of guerrilla warfare until 1898, when he found himself surrounded. Rather than allow himself to be captured, he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. The German soldiers removed his head and sent it to a museum in Berlin. Years later, at the end of World War I, the British sought the return of Mkwawa's skull to the Hihi as a thank you for their help in fighting the Germans. Despite the return being stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles, the skull wouldn't be returned until after World War II, when Sir Edward Twining took up the case, searching the Bremen's Museum collection of 2,000 skulls. 84 of those were from East Africa, and after narrowing it down to skulls with similar measurements to Mkwawa's surviving relatives, it was a simple case of choosing the one with the bullet hole. The skull was finally returned in 1954 and can now be found in a museum dedicated to the man himself in Kalenga, Tanzania. And there we have it, 5 posthumously preserved pieces of people. Following on from our previous story, next we meet a man who wouldn't settle for a body part. He wanted the whole body. Posthumous marriage, also called necrogamy, is a marriage in which at least one of the participating members is deceased. You may never have heard of this practice, but it's taken place in several countries throughout history, and in some through present times. In China, spirit marriages or ghost marriages are rare but well known. France has laws allowing for posthumous nuptials. Nazi Germany had a practice of marrying pregnant fiancés to the dead bodies of their soldiers to legalize their child. The Balava community in India practices necrogamy, and the second son of religious leader Sun Myung Moon was married to ballerina Julia Pak in a posthumous ceremony in South Korea. Families of the deceased typically arrange these marriages to continue the lineage, provide benefits to the surviving partner, or restore traditions. These unions are treated much like typical weddings in most cultures, with ceremonies, gifts, and cakes. But the deceased are typically represented by a photograph, an effigy, constructed of papier-mâché or similar. In any case, a posthumous marriage is not something those involved dreamt of or planned for. It is a necessity born out of cultural regulations or legal need. There was one man, though, who would have very much liked to marry his deceased bride out of nothing but sheer love. Or perhaps it was simply obsession. Either way, Carl Tanzler would do all he could to have the woman of his dreams. Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos was undeniably beautiful. Cuban, with black hair and dark eyes, she cut a striking figure. Hoyos was the daughter of a cigar maker, born in Key West, Florida in 1909. She was part of a large family and had married for the first time at age 16 to a man named Louis Mesa, who left her after she miscarried their first child. Things would go from bad to worse for her at age 21. She was desperately ill. Her mother brought her to the US Marine Hospital in Key West, where she walked into a radiologist's office. There, she met Carl Tanzler, who was instantly besotted. Carl Tanzler was a man of many names. Little is known of Tanzler's early life, but by the time the German man arrived in Key West, he was calling himself Count Karl von Kossel. He claimed he was a relative of the Countess von Kossel, whose ghost had visited him his entire childhood. He also claimed to have 9 university degrees, be a submarine captain, and an accomplished inventor. The little that has been confirmed of Tanzler's life shows that he was born in 1877, emigrated to Florida with his wife and 2 children in 1920, and promptly abandoned them to accept a position at the hospital in Key West. Since childhood, the Count had claimed to have received visions of a stunning dark-haired woman who was predestined to be his one true love. That woman now stood before him. In the spring of 1930, Tanzler examined Hoyos as his heart beat furiously, awestruck by the premonition come to life. But the examination revealed a diagnosis that was tantamount to a death sentence: tuberculosis. Though there was no known cure at the time, Tanzler wasn't willing to let de Hoyos slip away without a fight. Disregarding all hospital protocol, Tanzler began bringing tonics, elixirs and x-ray equipment to Hoyos' home. He claimed to have an extensive medical knowledge and was confident he could cure her. As Tanzler pressed potions and procedures on Hoyos, he also professed his love. The 53-year-old man attempted to woo the young girl with jewellery, clothing and proclamations of his deep, undying affection. His romantic feelings were unrequited and his treatments unsuccessful. On October 25, 1931, Elena died. If Tanzler's behaviour was strange before Elena's death, it was nothing compared to what followed. Tanzler was inconsolable. He insisted on paying for the funeral and mortuary services. He then erected an enormous above-ground tomb in Key West Cemetery for her remains, keeping the only key to the mausoleum himself. Tanzler then proceeded to spend every evening of the next 2 years at Hoyos' graveside. It was a strange habit, but stranger still when it suddenly stopped. At the same time, Tanzler was fired from his position at the hospital. He stopped appearing at Hoyos' tomb. Elena's family found the sudden change in habit odd. But then again, Tanzler had always been a bit weird when it came to Elena. The Hoyos family likely swapped many hypotheses about Tanzler's abrupt change, but none could be as strange as the truth. On his last visit to Elena's tomb in April of 1933, Tanzler used his key to let himself into the mausoleum, removed her corpse and pulled it back to his house on a toy wagon. No longer were nighttime visits to the cemetery required. Tanzler had Elena all to himself. Unsurprisingly, having passed away 2 years prior, Hoyos' corpse was in an advanced stage of decomposition. Tanzler set about repairing and maintaining the rotting flesh inside an old airplane he had repurposed into a crude medical laboratory. He used wires and coat hangers to reconstruct and support the body skeleton and set glass eyes behind the sunken lids. Tanzler then replaced any patches of decomposed skin with cloth soaked in plaster of Paris and wax. He stuffed the chest and abdomen with rags and fashioned a wig from hair Elena's mother had given him as a memento at the funeral. Pleased with his work, Tanzler dressed Elena's corpse in fine clothing, stockings, gloves and jewellery. He doused the body with perfume to cover the smell of decay and preserving agents. Tanzler then moved Elena's body into his own bed, where he slept beside it, and quite likely committed acts of necrophilia. He brought his dead bride presents of new clothing and jewels and installed a curtained veil around their bed for privacy. Preserving Elena's body was a constant chore, requiring Tanzler to routinely apply mortician's wax to the face, make repairs to her skeleton and keep up a steady application of perfumes, disinfectants and preserving agents. He'd kept up his ministrations for 7 years. He had always been a bit of an oddball and was largely written off as a recluse by most of the town. But Key West was a small community, and neighbours noticed Tanzler purchasing women's clothing and perfume. A local boy said he had passed by Tanzler's home one night to see him dancing in front of his fireplace with what appeared to be a large stuffed doll. Tanzler was never seen in public with a female, nor had any neighbours observed anyone visiting his home. He might have been buying the items for himself, but it didn't seem likely. And then there was the doll he was dancing with. It could just be a doll. But what if Tanzler had finally gotten over his obsession with Elena because he had taken her home? Elena's family heard the rumours and mulled them over. Tanzler's interest in Elena had been intense, and they had all felt a bit odd about the elaborate grave, the nighttime visits, and then the sudden stop. But had he really taken her body? It had been 9 years since her death. It was unthinkable. And yet, they had to know, either to squash the rumours about the man that had tried everything to save Elena, or to confront him. In October of 1940, Elena's sister couldn't wait any longer. She knocked on Tanzler's door and was led inside. There, she saw what she thought was an elaborate life-sized doll made to resemble her sister. She fled in terror and asked police to investigate. What she had thought to be a doll made of wax was the extensively preserved corpse of Elena. Tanzler was arrested for grave robbing. He underwent a psychiatric screening and was found mentally competent to stand trial on the charge of wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. Astoundingly, however, the case was dropped and Tanzler was released, as the statute of limitations for the crime had expired. After the discovery of Elena's corpse at Tanzler's home, it was examined by physicians and pathologists. They uncovered the great lengths Tanzler had gone to preserve the body. 2 physicians claiming years later that this included the grisly discovery of modifications he had made that appeared to facilitate sexual intercourse with the dead woman. For a time during the case, Elena's body was placed on display at a local funeral home, with nearly 7,000 people coming to see the bizarre creation for themselves. After the viewing, Elena's body was placed in an unmarked grave in a secret location to prevent any further tampering by Tanzler or others. After his release, Tanzler asked for the return of the body, though this request was swiftly denied. Public reaction to the disturbing crime was surprisingly compassionate, with many expressing a feeling that Tanzler was an eccentric, hopeless romantic, though it's likely that the Hoyos did not share that point of view. Tanzler eventually left Key West and his beloved Elena, moving to Pasco County near Zephyr Hills. He led a quiet life there, obtaining his US citizenship in 1950. But Tanzler did not live alone. He used the death mask to create a life-sized effigy of Elena and lived with it until his death at the age of 75 on July the 3rd, 1952. There are reports his body was discovered in the arms of his bizarre companion, though his obituary stated he was found on the floor behind an organ. It has been rumoured and written by many that Tanzler swapped the body of Elena with an effigy before fleeing Key West, or that he paid someone to return the remains to him. But there is no concrete evidence of this. There was also an article written in the 1980s claiming that renovation workers had found a note written by Tanzler in which he confessed to poisoning Elena to ease her suffering. We may never know all the details surrounding Tanzler's mystifying one-sided love affair, and it's quite likely that most would like to keep it that way. So, what do you make of this bizarre tale? Was Tanzler simply a man in love, or an obsessive necromantic? Head down to the comments to let us know. Our next story is that of Tarrare, a man whose appetite was said to be without rival. Have you ever watched a food eating contest? Nathan's Hot Dogs hosts one each July 4th in New York City. In 2021, champion eater Joey Chestnut broke his own world record by downing an astonishing 75 hot dogs and buns in 10 minutes. He's won the contest 14 times. Chestnut told reporters he begins training for the competition 6 months in advance. His training regimen included jaw and throat exercises, practice competitions, and water and lemon juice cleanses. Professional eaters like Chestnut work hard to train their bodies and minds to consume enormous amounts of food. But not every prolific eater in history has needed a strict training regimen to accomplish serious gluttony. In fact, in the late 18th century, a French soldier was such an extraordinary eater, he left medical professionals perplexed. Eating as performance art is nothing new, but in the past, it was undoubtedly more bizarre. Medieval show people consumed stones, spiders, snakes, and other stomach-curdling specimens. A 17th century man named Nicholas Wood earned the moniker the Great Eater of Kent for entertaining fairgoers by consuming 60 eggs, mutton, 3 large pies, and a black pudding in a single sitting. Likewise, Charles Tile of Dorset ate 133 eggs in an hour alongside a heaped serving of bread and bacon. And according to medical historian Jan Bonderson, a French showman named M. Dufour put away asps in hot oil, dishes of tortoise, bat and mole, and a roast owl in a sauce of glowing brimstone. He finished off with a dessert of toads topped with flies, crickets, spiders and caterpillars. To complete his show in front of a packed Parisian crowd, Dufour swallowed the candles on the table along with a flaming glass of brandy and opened his jaw wide so the audience could gasp at the flickering flames inside his throat. All of these were certainly impressive examples of epicures with no gag reflex and stretched stomachs. But the most extreme and bizarre of all these European epicures was Tarrare. Tarrare was born near Lyon, France, around 1772. His exact date of birth and even his real name is unrecorded and unknown. As a child, Tarrare displayed a puzzlingly enormous appetite. By the time he was a teen, the boy could eat his weight in beef each day. His parents, unable to provide for him, forced him to leave home. Desperate and alone, Tarrare joined with a band of thieves, vagabonds and sex workers on a tour of the French provinces, begging for and stealing food. The curious man caught the attention of a travelling charlatan who hired him as a warm-up act for his quackery tour. Tarrare's job was to draw a crowd by eating corks, stones and large animals, along with a basket full of apples, one after another. It wasn't a bad gig, but to Tarrare it was quite clear he was the reason for the crowds, not the doctor's confidence trick cures. So in 1788, he moved to Paris to become a street performer. By all accounts, his act was successful in drawing crowds, but it certainly wasn't easy on his gullet. During one such show, Tarrare suffered an acute obstruction of the intestine and had to be carried by his spectators to the Hôtel Dieu hospital, where he was treated with laxatives. Ever the showman, Tarrare offered to demonstrate his talents to the surgeon by swallowing his watch and chain. The surgeon, unamused, promised that if Tarrare did so, he would cut him open and recover his valuables. Tarrare was immediately recognizable to Parisians. Despite his regular feasting, he was slim and of average height. At the age of 17, he weighed only 100 pounds and was said to have soft hair and kind eyes. The only features that gave a hint to his strange talent were his wider than normal mouth, heavily stained teeth, pouchy cheeks, and a sagging, distended stomach that, when empty, could be wrapped around his waist like a belt. When you drew nearer, though, it was apparent something was different about Tarrare. His body exuded heat. He was always hot to the touch, and he sweated heavily. He had a foul body odour that got worse after eating, when his eyes would become bloodshot, his cheeks would bloom red, and vapour would rise visibly from his body, like cartoon stink waves. His stench was described as so horrific in many accounts that people dared not get within 20 paces of him. There are some accounts stating the man suffered from chronic diarrhea of such a horrid smell it could clear a privy instantly, as we can all imagine. But Tarrare's oddness began and ended with his body. He showed no signs of mental illness or other unusual behaviours, and those who knew him described him as relatively normal, if a bit dull. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, Tarrare joined the French army, but quickly found himself admitted to the hospital at Ols-Oran for extreme exhaustion. There, he was given quadruple rations but remained hungry. He would scavenge for garbage, eat scraps left by other patients, and sneak into the apothecary's room to eat the poultices. Mystified, the surgeons Dr. Courville and Pierre-François Percy ordered him to remain in their care to conduct a series of tests. They watched in amazement as Tarrare downed a meal designed for 15 labourers, including plates of grease and salt along with 4 gallons of milk, before falling asleep, his belly taut and inflated like a giant balloon. Next, they presented Tarrare with a live cat. He immediately tore into it with his teeth, drank its blood and ate the entire creature off the bones before vomiting up its fur and skin. Tarrare would later eat snakes, lizards, eels and puppies as staff looked on. Doctors, they said. Military authorities had begun to press for Tarrare to be returned to duty, but the doctors couldn't stand to let this appalling and bewildering specimen go. Courville devised a plan to appease both the military leaders and his scientific curiosity. Tarrare would courier documents within his body. After a test where Tarrare swallowed a wooden box with a document inside that proved to emerge in good condition, he was officially employed as a spy. His first task was to deliver a message to a French colonel held prisoner in a Prussian fortress. General de Beauharnais was not in doubt of Tarrare's physical abilities, but questioned the man's mental state. Reluctant to trust him with crucial military information from the jump, the general wrote a simple note asking that the colonel confirm the message had been received and reply with any helpful information about Prussian troop movements. Beauharnais was right to be careful. Tarrare was captured nearly immediately, probably because he spoke not a word of German. Or maybe it was the scavenging in the gutter, chasing after small animals to eat, or ever-present reeking odour that attracted attention. The glutton endured a strip search and whipping without betraying his mission, and was brought before the Prussian commander, General Zogli, before being imprisoned. After 24 hours of captivity and likely many painful hours of hunger, Tarrare relented and confessed the details of his mission. He was chained to a latrine until the wooden box emerged. Zogli was incensed that the documents contained only a dummy message and performed a mock execution on Tarrare. After being led to the gallows and a noose placed around his neck, Tarrare was taken away, beaten savagely, and released near French lines. His short career as a military spy was over. Terrified and desperate, Tarrare returned to the military hospital and begged Dr. Percy to cure his hunger by any means possible. Percy undertook a series of experimental treatments involving laudanum, opiates, wine vinegar, tobacco pills, and large quantities of soft-boiled eggs. His efforts were futile. Tarrare remained ravenous, sneaking out to butcher shops to scavenge and beg for organ meat. He fought dogs for carrion in the streets and dug through gutters and rubbish heaps in search of things to eat. He was caught several times drinking the blood of other patients who had undergone bloodletting. Several times he even snuck into the hospital mortuary to nibble on the corpses within. Hospital staff lobbied for Tarrare to be removed to a lunatic asylum, but Dr. Percy remained his staunch defender, eager to continue his experiments and devise a cure. But not even Percy was willing to stand up for his prized patient when a toddler went missing within the hospital. As the prime suspect, Tarrare was chased from the hospital and never returned. Where Tarrare went after being driven from his refuge at Aux-Aurins is unknown, but 4 years later, in 1789, he stumbled into a hospital in Versailles, desperately ill. Dr. Percy was notified of his former patient's sudden reappearance and hurried to see him. Tarrare told the physician he believed he was suffering from a golden fork he had eaten several years prior, which he thought to be lodged inside him. Percy, however, recognized that Tarrare was actually in the advanced stages of tuberculosis and knew that nothing could be done to save his life. A month later, Tarrare began experiencing continuous diarrhea composed of blood and pus, and he died shortly after that. His body began to rot at an alarming rate, but Versailles' chief surgeon, M. Tessier, could not resist conducting an autopsy on the strange corpse. He discovered that Tarrare's gullet was unusually wide. When the jaw was opened, he could see directly down into the stomach, which was covered in ulcers and filled nearly his entire abdominal cavity. The liver and gallbladder were likewise unusually large. According to the London Medical and Physical Journal, the stench of the body was so insupportable that M. Tessier, chief surgeon of the hospital, could not carry his investigation to any further extent. Alas, the golden fork was never discovered. There has never again been a modern case quite like Tarrare's. And while there is a more recent diagnosis of polyphagia to account for people with insatiable eating habits, none have felt a hunger to the extreme of Tarrare, who was willing to consume literally anything to appease his appetite. There are a few modern theories about Tarrare's unique condition. Doctors suspect he likely had an enlarged hypothalamus, the gland responsible for regulating the body's temperature and causing the sensation of hunger. It's also possible this was coupled with a case of pica, which causes the eating of non-edible objects. A parasite is one other possible explanation as to why Tarrare never put on weight. A hookworm or roundworm may have been helping to consume those massive portions. Hypothyroidism, Prader-Willi syndrome, extreme iron deficiency and a damaged amygdala are also contenders for causes of the man's bizarre and voracious appetite. And strangest of all, in the same time and area, a man named Charles Domery, a Polish soldier serving in the French army, was eating 10 times the rations of the British soldiers he had been captured by. He would also eat whatever he could get his hands on, with it being said that he ate nearly 200 cats in a year, and if no other food was available, he would eat up to 5 pounds of grass a day. There's even a story that states while on a ship he tried to eat the severed leg of a crew member who had been hit by cannon fire. Like Tarrare, he was studied extensively with no conclusions. Is it possible that two men were suffering due to a common environmental cause? The answers to that are lost to the sands of time and the decay of the flesh. While those with cats, puppies or even small children who encountered Tarrare labelled him something of a monster, Tarrare always preferred to eat good food cooked for humans and was merely a victim of his voracious hunger. One can only hope Tarrare's appetite has finally been satiated in the afterlife. Do you have someone in your family or perhaps one of your friends that has a hunger that rivals Tarrare's? Let us know in the comments below. Death-defying stunts are normally the preserve of young adrenaline seekers, but our next tale is that of a woman who took on a deadly stunt in her 60s. Since the dawn of time, man has met challenges face on, doing things just to prove that he can, climbing mountains because they're there, crossing seas to find out what lies beyond, travelling to space to meet our destiny, and throwing himself over a waterfall in a barrel because sometimes we just do stupid shit. Niagara Falls is a natural spectacle that attracts millions of tourists each year. Though nowhere near the tallest waterfall in the world, there being around 500 taller. The thing that stands out at these falls is the sheer amount of water going over. At its highest point on the Canadian side, the average drop is 188 feet or 57 meters. For comparison, Angel Falls in Venezuela has a drop of some 979 meters or 3,212 foot. The amount of raging water that cascades over Niagara Falls is much greater though, with some 1,416 tons of water crashing down every second. So, of course, your first thought would be, I bet if I go inside a rickety old barrel, I could survive going over that. Okay, maybe not, but thoughts along those lines entered the head of one Annie Edson Taylor at the dawn of the 20th century. Annie had her reasons, however. She had decided to go over the falls on her 63rd birthday and had lived quite the life up to that point. Born in Auburn, New York in 1838, Annie was one of 8 children. Her father passed away when she was just 12 years old, but left the family with enough money to live comfortably for a time. Annie studied to become a teacher, and during this time she met her husband, David Taylor. They married and had a child who sadly died in his infancy, with her husband also dying soon after. Widowed and alone, Annie drifted between towns and cities and various jobs before settling in Bay City, Michigan, where she hoped to become a dance instructor, eventually setting up her own dance school. She would also teach music before traveling to San Antonio, Texas, then on to Mexico City, looking for work after the dance school proved less popular than expected. She would arrive back in Bay City with a need and desire to financially secure her later years. She also wanted to help Two of her friends who had fallen on hard times, and with the likes of death-defying showmen like Harry Houdini regularly pulling in huge crowds and big money, she quickly came up with a plan. She would go over the ferocious Niagara Falls in a barrel. She would be the first to attempt this stunt, but not the first to have gone over the falls. The first recorded instance of people going over comes from 1853, when three men who had been working on a boat and drinking attempted to row from Goat Island over to the mainland. Their boat capsized and two of the men went over the falls, with the third, Joseph Avery, managing to grab hold of tree roots growing from a rock. He was able to weather the strong current for 18 hours. The next day, rescue attempts began, culminating in a boat being tethered to the nearby Goat Island Bridge and guided down to the stranded Avery. He was able to climb onto the boat, but it almost immediately capsized, flinging him into the waters and over the falls to his death. The falls would go on to claim many more lives, but more about that later. For Annie's attempt, she would have the protection of a specially made barrel constructed from oak and iron, with the inside padded with a mattress. Initially, she found it difficult to find support for her attempt, with people worried they could be helping with a potential suicide. To help prove to these doubters that the barrel was safe, a cat was placed inside and sent over the Horseshoe Falls 2 days before Annie's own attempt. The barrel survived, and despite, quite understandably, being rather shook up and with a cut to its head, so did the cat. Annie, posing with the barrel and pummeled puss a short while later. Soon enough, it was Annie's turn, and on October 24th, 1901, his 63rd birthday, the barrel was placed into the water from the side of a rowboat, and she climbed inside along with her lucky heart-shaped pillow. The lid was screwed down and a bicycle pump was used to compress the air in the barrel, with the hole for that then being plugged with a cork. Then Annie was set adrift near the American shore south of Goat Island, with the current carrying her towards and over the Canadian Horseshoe Falls. A short while later, the barrel was found, and all in, the stunt had taken less than 20 minutes. Inside was a relieved Annie Taylor, shaken, bruised and, like her cat, sporting a small cut on her head, but alive. The first to go over the falls on purpose and survive, though she was in no rush to repeat her feat, stating, "If it was with my dying breath, I would caution anyone against attempting the feat. I would sooner walk up to the mouth of a cannon, knowing it was going to blow me to pieces, than make another trip over the fall." Despite her warning, many others would make the journey over into the abyss, planned or otherwise. The next time someone went over the falls, it wasn't part of an elaborate stunt. Ed Delahanty was a professional baseball player who 2 years after Annie's stunt in July 1903 got himself thrown off the train he was on after drinking 5 drams of whiskey and threatening passengers with a straight razor. He made his way along the railway bridge that spanned the Niagara River on foot, and at some point either fell or jumped into the water below. His body was found 2 weeks later with one leg severed. In 1911, Englishman Bobby Leach, who had already parachuted into the Niagara River from the upper steel arch bridge, decided he would attempt to be the first man to survive going over the falls. His mode of transport would be more industrial looking than Annie's wooden barrel, it being more of a steel cylinder with wooden bumpers at either end. Strapped into a harness inside his armoured tube, Bobby was set adrift at the mouth of Chippewa Creek and drifted towards the falls. There was early drama before reaching them, however, as his barrel struck a large rock which tore off the front bumper before travelling on and going over the falls. The gathered crowds gawped in wonder, then fell silent as they awaited news of whether he had survived, before giving a roaring cheer when it was found he had accomplished his goal of becoming the second person to make it over the falls with his life. He had made it, not only the second person to do so, but the first man and youngest at a sprightly 54 years old. Sadly for such a daredevil, Bobby's death would come in much more mundane fashion. 15 years after his famous stunt, and Bobby was now living in New Zealand, where one day, while walking down a street in Auckland, he tripped on some discarded orange peel and broke his leg. Infection set in, and during an operation to remove the leg, Bobby passed away. His and Annie's daring stunts would lead to many others trying their hand at the feat, and not all would taste success. Those to have tried but sadly failed include Charles Stevens, who was known as the Demon Barber of Bedminster. He was another Englishman, this time from Bristol. Both Bobby Leach and daredevil William Redhill advised him to test his barrel before going over, but he refused. In his barrel, he would be using an anvil for ballast, strapping himself to the vessel and his feet to the said anvil. You can probably guess what happened next. Upon hitting the water, the anvil smashed through the wooden barrel and sank to the bottom, along with most of Charles. Only his right arm was recovered, still strapped inside his vessel. George Stathakis was the next to try his luck and fail. After initially surviving the trip over, his barrel became trapped behind one of the falls. He had enough air inside to last 8 hours, but it would be over 18 hours before the barrel was recovered. He had company inside for his final moments, as he had taken his pet tortoise with him, thought to be over 150 years old. The tortoise survived. William Redhill Jr., son of the daredevil that warned Charles Stevens about his attempt, decided to give it a go himself in 1951. He was killed when his barrel was obliterated on impact at the bottom of the falls. His death causing a change in attitudes towards those trying to accomplish the stunt, leading to further attempts being banned. This kept the stunters at bay for 10 years until 1961, when New Yorker Nathan Boyer went over the falls in a 6-foot orb made from metal and rubber, nicknamed the Plungosphere. He survived and became the first African American to complete the stunt, though he was promptly arrested. There was a spate of law-breaking stuntmen in the 1980s, as the decade saw 5 people attempt and succeed in going over the falls and surviving. The money they made from the ensuing publicity more than covering the $500 fine they would receive. With 5 people on the trot surviving the falls, perhaps people had started to become a bit blasé about the risks involved. In 1990, Jesse Sharp attempted to go over in just a canoe. He was so confident that he had booked a table at a restaurant 4 miles down from the falls, where he would continue paddling down to after his dive over the falls. He had decided not to wear a life jacket in case it hindered an escape if he got trapped beneath the falls, and also no helmet, so the cameras could capture his best side. His body was never recovered. 2 of the people that had survived attempts in the 1980s, David Munday and Steve Trotter, would make it 2 for 2 in the 90s, with Trotter going over in a double barrel made from 2 heater tanks welded together. He was joined inside by Laurie Martin, with both surviving, though the fine of some $14,700 was a tad more than the one he received a decade earlier. In 2003, Kirk Jones became the first person to survive a trip over the falls unaided. The story goes that he and his friends had been drinking and had planned to film the stunt, though his friends couldn't work the camcorder, so no footage exists. Jones claimed that his trip over the falls was actually a suicide attempt, but this didn't stop authorities fining him $2,300 and permanently banning him from entering Canada. 14 years later, undeterred, he returned, this time to the American side of the falls with an inflatable ball for protection. He may have failed in his suicide attempt but succeeded in pulling off an impressive stunt last time. But this time out, he failed an impressive stunt but succeeded with the suicide. The ball was picked up by the Maid of the Mist, and his body was later found near Lake Ontario. At the time of this video going live, Kirk was the last known person to go over the falls as part of a stunt. But what became of the first to brave the falls for money? Well, Annie did manage to secure some funds from her venture, but perhaps not as much as she would have hoped. She would earn money speaking of her experience, but she suffered a setback when her manager ran off with her barrel, with her spending much of her savings hiring private detectives to find it. It eventually turned up in Chicago. She spent her final years posing with tourists at her souvenir stand, attempting to make money on the stock exchange and flirting with the idea of taking a second trip over the falls, though she never would. She also tried her hand working as a medium, writing a novel and providing magnetic therapy treatments before passing away in 1921 at the age of 82. She may not have made enough to have lived as comfortably as she would have liked in her later years, but the stunt she attempted out of desperation has secured her a place in history and, for better or worse, has inspired many to give it a go for themselves. And for that we say, hats off to you, Annie. Though we'd encourage anyone thinking of trying it to maybe think twice. And if you've been feeling low, remember, it's never as dark as it seems, and there is always someone you can talk to, someone who will listen and someone who will help. The Victorian era was rife with bizarre happenings. One lesser spoken of event was an organised fight that was said to have taken place between dog and man. Like with many things good and bad, we had the Romans to thank for dogfighting and blood sport in general. Animals of all kinds would fight in the colosseums and circuses of the Roman Empire, from dogs to lions and of course people. Dogs were also regularly taken into battle. By the late 1600s in the UK, dogfighting along with bear and bull baiting were widespread, with bulls being slaughtered after fights as it was believed it made the meat more tender. By the 19th century, the prohibitive costs of bear baiting saw it largely die out, and in 1835, the Cruelty to Animals Act was introduced, with all forms of animal baiting and fighting being outlawed. Though this put an end to much of the cruelty to cattle, it drove dogfighting underground and created a thriving scene, most notably in the north of England and in the Midlands, and it was here that the fabled fight between dwarf and dog took place. More specifically, in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent. The story was reported by one James Greenwood, writing for the Daily Telegraph in 1874. In it, he paints a vivid picture. The scene was a place about 16 feet square, with bare walls and a brick floor. And at the four sides, a rope was already extended, leaving a space of about a yard between it and the wall, while the floor was neatly sawdusted. The crowd, he states, was made up of pit lads, workers in the local mines, with a sprinkling of individuals of the rough and costermonger order. Now, for those, costermonger is people who would sell you stuff from like barrows, along with half a dozen swells of the country fancy, swells being posh people. Altogether, there must have been around 50 in attendance. The person that caught his eye, however, he states, was a dwarf, not more than 4 foot 5 inches tall, with grizzled grey hair and tremendous hands and feet. This was Brummie, one of the combatants in the coming fight. The other was Physic, a dirty white bulldog. Both parties were tethered to the wall, so either could be pulled back if need be, with enough rope to meet in the middle of the ring. When asked if he was ready, Brummie answered, "Oh, I'm on. Bring him as soon as you like." With that said, it's said that 11 rounds ensued between man and beast, with Brummie's rules being that he had to fight knelt down or on all fours, with no grappling unless Physic sunk his teeth in. Sounds lovely. Greenwood goes on to describe a bloody and vicious bout between the two. Brummie, arms pouring blood, and Physic's head being extremely swollen and having lost 2 teeth. Brummie is said to have KO'd the bulldog in the 11th round, with Greenwood stating that the whole thing was a horrid spectacle and that he would have gone through it for nothing if any such tournaments are held in Hanley again. The story caused a public outcry when it was published and could be described as going viral, as it spread across the globe, being printed in several newspapers in the United States. An investigation was launched by the RSPCA and local police in an effort to track down the perpetrators, with little luck. They sought the help of the article writer, but he said that it was dark when he was led to the venue, and in his excitement he failed to take a note of any of the surrounding buildings. He narrowed it down to one of the main streets, but authorities said that no building in that area could house the basement location he spoke of. The writer, Greenwood, was a pioneer of investigative journalism, often employing disguises to reveal slice-of-life views of the 19th century underclasses. He was also a prolific writer of fiction, however. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the fight between man and dog was very likely to be another such work. The press of the time sparing no punches as they tore the story and Greenwood to shreds. There were even pantomimes created poking fun at the tale. As previously mentioned, Greenwood's work focused on the lower classes, and in parts of the story he speaks of how the people of the area cared more for their fighting dogs than their own children. Whether this story was created to draw attention to the horrors of the continuing underground dogfighting scene, or simply early fake news designed to titillate readers and reinforce stereotypes, we'll never know. In fact, the story may have inspired several actual bouts between man and dog. One such event took place in East London in 1892. This time, the people behind it were found, and they state the dog won, biting off part of the man's ear. Today, dogfighting is thankfully widely outlawed across the globe, though the battle continues to stamp out the underground circles where it still takes place, along with convincing the countries where it's still legal to rethink their ways. Next up, we explore the life of a woman whose name would become synonymous with the spread of disease, Mary Mallon, better known to some as Typhoid Mary. Born in Cookstown, County Tyrone in 1869, it's thought that the curse of typhoid was bestowed upon Mary Mallon from birth, as her mother suffered from it when she was born. At age 15, she left the Emerald Isle, seeking a better life in the United States, where she would stay with her aunt and uncle. For a time she worked as a maid, but by 1900 she found herself working as a cook for several wealthy families in New York, and it was during this period that she would gain her notoriety. Just 2 weeks after she began working at a residence in Mamaroneck, several people came down with typhoid fever. Moving to Manhattan in 1901, she began working for a new family. Again, several developed typhoid symptoms, with it proving fatal for the family's laundress. Mallon was soon on the move once more and began working for a lawyer, but quickly left after 7 of the 8 family members fell ill. By now, if anyone suspected Mary of being the source, they didn't act on it, and she was able to continue moving from home to home. Fast forward to 1904, and Mallon found herself working for another lawyer, Henry Gilsey. Once again, the family's laundress fell ill, this time along with 4 other servants. The servants lived separately from the main household, so this time the family was spared. An investigator, Dr. R.L. Wilson, pinned the outbreak on the laundress, but was unable to prove it. By 1906, Mary had seemingly only infected one more person, another laundress, and no one was the wiser to the fact that she was the source. That would soon change. In August of that year, she took a job working for wealthy banker Charles Henry Warren and his family. She would travel with them to Oyster Bay, Long Island, to a holiday home marketed to the well-to-do. Over a week-long period, 6 of the 11 family members came down with the disease. Typhoid is caused by a bacteria found in unsanitary conditions, so for an outbreak to occur amongst a wealthy family on Long Island was virtually unheard of. Fearing that having his residence connected to an outbreak of this pauper's disease would put off future renters, the landlord employed several investigators to try and get to the bottom of the flare-up. All areas of the house where the bacteria could reside were checked and ruled out as being the source. An old lady who lived on the beach and who had sold the family clams became the new focus of the investigation. But when it was discovered that other families who had also eaten clams supplied by her hadn't fallen ill, she was soon ruled out as well. Unsatisfied with the inconclusive results, sanitation engineer George Soper was brought in. Soper had been investigating the outbreak in New York City, where some 3,000 people had been infected. He quickly set about trying to trace the root of this infection, working his way back through visitors to the house and the timeline of the infections. His attention was soon drawn to the fact that cases began not long after they took on their new cook, and that she left the household soon after the first case had been diagnosed. Looking deeper into her past, he soon found the trail of cases she left in her wake, along with the fact that she would disappear from the scene each time, leaving no forwarding address for her former employer. Soper also theorized that Mary was an asymptomatic carrier, the first known, able to spread the deadly bacteria without suffering any ill effects herself. Soper quickly became obsessed with tracing Mary, his day-to-day work becoming less like that of a sanitation engineer and more akin to that of a gumshoe detective. He was so determined to track down the spreader as he had seen the impact that typhoid outbreaks could have. Typhoid is a bacterial infection caused by a specific type of salmonella. Symptoms normally begin 6 to 30 days after exposure and can range from mild to severe. The most common symptom is a high fever along with severe stomach pains. This can quickly progress to chronic fatigue and delirium, with the bacteria causing intestinal hemorrhaging and even perforation. Eventually, the illness can lead to inflammation of various organs, including encephalitis, inflammation of the brain. If none of these lead to death, then usually dehydration or the added complication of pneumonia or bronchitis could see off the unfortunate sufferer. There was also little in the way of treatment for the condition at the time. Despite a vaccine existing, it was mostly given to soldiers to prevent them falling ill in the squalid conditions of the battlefield. In March of 1907, Soper was informed of another outbreak in a wealthy household on Park Avenue. The Bowen family were the unlucky ones this time around, with a maid and their daughter becoming ill. The daughter would eventually succumb to the disease. Soper already had his interest piqued by the news, but when he was informed that the cook was still working there, he set off immediately. Rushing to the scene, he finally came face to face with Mary, who was somewhat less excited about seeing Soper and hearing his accusations, threatening him with a carving fork when he asked her to supply urine and stool samples indeed. Soper would arrange another meeting with Mary, this time bringing along a medical doctor in an attempt to convince her. She again refused to give samples, stating that the outbreaks were everywhere, caused by contaminated food and water. With his options dwindling, Soper moved to have Mary arrested as a public health threat. She was a strong Irish woman, however, and it took 5 policemen to subdue her, with Soper's associate Dr. Josephine Baker having to sit on her at one point. She was then transported to Willard Parker Hospital, where she was forced to finally give samples. They showed massive amounts of the typhoid bacteria, and under questioning she revealed that she rarely washed her hands. This wasn't unheard of, however, as germ theory was still battling to replace the idea of miasma or bad air amongst many. Days after her first encounter with Soper, Mary was packed off to North Brother Island to be held in quarantine, still unbelieving that she was the carrier of the deadly bacteria. With his case complete, Soper published the story of his efforts in an article for the Journal of American Medical Association. This soon led to Mallon attracting massive media attention, and it would be they who would give her the nickname of Typhoid Mary. Mary was less than enamored with this new moniker or Soper. He visited her and told her he would write a book and give her part of the royalties. Enraged, Mallon refused and locked herself in the bathroom until he had left. During the time on the island, Mary turned down an operation to remove her gallbladder, a procedure that was risky but that doctors thought would cure her condition. She was then subjected to a host of medical treatments and tests, leading her to feel as though she was being used as a guinea pig. Mary would remain quarantined on the island for nearly 3 years. It was then that the New York State Commissioner of Health decided disease carriers should no longer be isolated, stating that Mary could return to the mainland if she agreed to stop working as a cook and took the necessary steps to improve her hygiene so as to protect any future employers. Mary agreed, and in February 1910, she returned to the mainland. On her return, she found a job as a laundress, a seemingly popular profession at this time. This paid less than half the wage of a cook, however. An injury to her arm then became infected, would see her unable to work for 6 months. Finding herself in a financial bind, the temptation to return to the kitchen proved too much. Using false names and avoiding the agencies that found her work with wealthy families before, Mary moved into the mass sector, working in hotels, restaurants and spas. Again, she would move from job to job once a typhoid outbreak inevitably happened. SOPA was once again put on the case but had trouble tracking her. That was until Mary began working at Sloan Hospital for Women, where 25 people became infected with 2 dying. The head obstetrician called in SOPA to help find the cause, and he managed to identify Mary from the description given and a handwriting sample. She fled but was later captured by police and returned to North Brother Island 5 years after her release in March 1915, and it would be there that she would remain. By 1918, she was allowed to take day trips to the mainland, but always had to return to isolation. Eventually, she was given a private 1-story cottage on the island and a job as a lab technician, washing bottles, preparing glasses, and keeping records. At age 63, Mary had a stroke that left her paralysed down one side, and she passed away 6 years later in 1938. Her body cremated and buried back on the mainland in a ceremony attended by 9 people. By the time she passed away, more than 400 other asymptomatic carriers had been identified in New York, but she was the only one sentenced to live in quarantine, a victim of her condition and the infamy she received from media coverage. With the development of antibiotics and improvements in sanitation, typhoid has largely been eradicated in the West, though it still plagues many developing countries to this day. So, what do you make of the life of Mary Mallon? Do you think her forced isolation was justified to protect the masses, or did the authorities overstep the mark? In our last story, we explore what happens when bizarre media and bizarre reality collide. It was the 1980s and Dungeons and Dragons was taking over the world, but not in the way you might think. The game may have been popular amongst kids, teenagers and young adults. However, their parents were not quite as thrilled. Because for them, this fantasy role-playing game was nothing more than a demonic art that encouraged their children to embrace Satanism.
Dungeons and Dragons, they're just games. These rock musicians, it's just a song, it's games. The cartoons, they're just sort of make-believe. Are they really things like demons? Well, the answer is you better believe it.
In this episode of Well I Never, the story of how one fantasy role-playing game was caught up in widespread hysteria that saw American fundamentalist Christian organizations denouncing it as part of an evil satanic ritual. Dungeons and Dragons may be renowned all over the world and enjoying a resurgence in popularity due to the central role it plays in Netflix Stranger Things, but surprisingly enough, it traces its roots to Lake Geneva. Perhaps not the one you're thinking of. This Lake Geneva is a small city in Wisconsin where in 1974 a pair of game designers named Ernest Gary Gygax and David Arneson came up with its fantasy role-playing concept. Unable to find a publisher, Gygax, along with his longtime friend Don Kay, formed a company called Tactical Studies Rules and decided to distribute the rulebook themselves. It was an instant hit, with the website Nerdist attributing its success to how Dungeons and Dragons was a, quote, game where anything can happen and players have total freedom of action. Its time frame is literally infinite. A game could go on for 10, 20 or even 100 years, if not limited by the lifespans of the players. Better yet, the players' characters would improve every session, growing in power and knowledge." End quote. Unfortunately, a string of bad business decisions would almost lead to the demise of Dungeons & Dragons, but luckily it was acquired by a gaming company called Wizards of the Coast in 1997. It has since gone through several variations, although the basic setting remains the same, a medieval fantasy world wherein players assume different characters and go on many exciting adventures, all the while guided by a storyteller traditionally referred to as the Dungeon Master. Dungeons & Dragons may be a world-famous and beloved piece of popular culture, but it isn't without its fair share of controversies. For instance, an urban myth claimed that the game's role-playing aspect frequently resulted in players experiencing a psychotic break and losing touch with reality. This stemmed from the 1979 disappearance of a 16-year-old James Dallas Egbert III. It's true, he was a big fan of the game, but he was also struggling with many personal issues in his life. Without adequate support, he resolved to take his own life, disappearing into utility tunnels situated beneath the University of Michigan campus, where he planned to take an overdose of sedatives. The private investigator hired to find him speculated that he had gotten lost in the tunnels while playing a live-action version of the game, which was picked up by the media and reported as fact, even though it had only been a theory of his. Egbert was later found alive, but would sadly succeed in his efforts a year later. The story of Egbert would inspire a 1982 made-for-TV movie, Mazes and Monsters, which starred a young Tom Hanks. The film played to the fears of the times. In one of the opening scenes, a news anchor warns that the legally distinct Mazes and Monsters game can lead to a loss of distinction between fantasy and reality, and possibly the loss of life in the process. Hanks plays Robbie Wheeling, whose mind breaks while playing the game. He then embarks on a quest to the Twin Towers, which he plans to jump off of while casting a spell.
TJ, what am I doing here?
Though he is eventually stopped, his mind never recovers.
Freelick! Aren't you dead? Didn't you die when you leaped into the pit?
Hey, come on, Robbie, stop fooling around.
It is you, Freelick. You have been restored to the living. Whoever did that is a great holy man. A greater holy man even than I.
Another controversy was the 1988 murder of Leith von Stein, who was bludgeoned to death by a masked assailant acting on the orders of his stepson, Chris Pritchard, who allegedly wanted his $2 million fortune. A game map of his mansion that had been created by Pritchard and his role-playing group was seized as evidence, which again brought Dungeons & Dragons more negative publicity. These controversies helped the game get swept up in the wider Satanic Panic, which gripped the United States and even parts of the United Kingdom during the 1980s. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s didn't appear out of nowhere. Rather, it was instigated by several incidents and exacerbated by the media's habit of sensationalizing such events. It was an episode that had been brewing for many years. One of its triggers was the string of violent crimes committed by the Manson family in the summer of 1969. The cult brutally murdered a total of 9 people, including the famous actress Sharon Tate, who, at the time, was living in a seemingly secure luxury home in Los Angeles. The violent nature of her death sparked public fear and outrage. According to the website Dicebreaker, quote, "A lot of the imagery left behind led the American public to believe that the killings were ritualistic in nature. This set the scene for a disrupted America that wasn't able to see itself as wholesome anymore. Gone was the idea that the innocent were safe and secure. With the killing of Tate, who also unfortunately happened to be pregnant at the time, North America fell into a dark spiral of paranoia." End quote. From there, violence in the United States escalated. The 1970s saw a slew of serial killers terrorizing various parts of the country, such as Ted Bundy, whose crimes were so horrific that his own legal team described him as the very definition of heartless evil. There was also John Wayne Gacy, who raped and murdered more than 30 young men, as well as the Zodiac Killer, whose real identity is much speculated about, whilst remaining unknown. Meanwhile, across the pond, the United Kingdom was dealing with the Yorkshire Ripper, who would later be identified as Peter Sutcliffe. In 1981, he was convicted of murdering 13 women and sentenced to life imprisonment. As ghastly as these serial killers were, their crimes were sensationalized further by the media. Their coverage was extensive and would often include wild speculation or information that actually harmed investigations, simultaneously sowing a fear in the public's psyche that a serial killer lay in wait around every corner, while giving criminals like Bundy and Manson the attention they craved. Another trigger was the creation of the Church of Satan, which was established in 1966 by Anton LaVey, the author of the Satanic Bible. A few years later, the horror film The Exorcist was released, which further added to the public's paranoia that devils were present and would stop at nothing to feed on their souls. For some experts, other triggers for the mass hysteria include the Tylenol murders in 1982, which saw 7 people dying after unknowingly consuming Tylenol-branded capsules laced with potassium cyanide. There was also a persistent urban myth that drugs and needles were mixed in with Halloween candy, which unsurprisingly made parents fear for their children's safety. This was exacerbated by the photos of missing kids on the sides of milk cartons, a practice that began in the early 80s. This widespread panic and paranoia could perhaps be explained by the many societal changes taking place in the 1980s. In the article titled "The Satanic Panic Beyond Dungeons and Dragons," the website Bell of Lost Souls wrote, quote, "The 1980s had its own dangers pointed directly at children and the traditional nuclear family. Societal norms were changing yet again, and there was pushback from folks at odds with urbanization. They didn't like the idea of women joining the workforce instead of staying at home. Their pushback against these changes came in the form of Christian fundamentalism, Jerry Falwell's fire and brimstone preaching, and the Moral Majority Organization began to gain traction." End quote. Regardless of what triggered them, the paranoia that the American public felt explained why, in the 1980s, several Christian organizations accused Dungeons and Dragons of being a threat to good morals and values, further saying that it encouraged the youth to embrace Satanism. Their claims were exacerbated by the death of a high school student named Irvin Lee Pulling, who fatally shot himself in 1982. Even though he was known to be suffering from mental health issues, his mother still blamed the game for his suicide. Patricia Pulling tried to sue Tactical Studies Rules, who at the time was still in charge of distributing Dungeons and Dragons. However, her lawsuit was dismissed. She even went so far as to found an organization called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. They described the game as, quote, "a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summonings, necromantics, divination, and other teachings." End quote. Pulling and her organization ended up garnering a lot of media attention, especially from Christian fundamentalist news outlets, which unsurprisingly supported their campaign. They even appeared on the hit television show 60 Minutes, which featured them alongside Gary Gygax, the co-creator of the game. For some conservative-minded people in the United States at the time, Dungeons and Dragons was a direct attack on their religious and moral values, which had already been threatened by 2 civil rights rulings: public school desegregation in 1970 and the recently overturned Roe v. Wade ruling of 1973. Theologians Peter Leithart and George Grant even published a pamphlet called The Catechism of the New Age in 1987, wherein they held that the immorality of Dungeons and Dragons stemmed from how its gameplay allowed for too much freedom for critical thinking, which could lead the youth to come up with heretical ideas. This wasn't the first time that Christians published literature criticizing Dungeons and Dragons. In 1984, an evangelical cartoonist named Jack Chick created a comic called Dark Dungeons, wherein he depicted a dungeon mistress as a cult leader whose magical powers were intensified every time she committed a ritualistic murder. He also partnered with Dr. Rebecca Brown, who had been stripped of her medical license after diagnosing mentally ill patients with demonic possession. Besides Christians rallying against Dungeons and Dragons, the Satanic Panic of the 1980s also saw several preschools in the United States being accused of misconduct and embracing Satanism. Perhaps the most notorious was the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, where in 1984, 7 employees were accused of sexually abusing students. However, according to the website Dicebreaker, quote, these claims were never founded on evidence, and the accusations were sweeping and wild. They included people turning into witches and flying, flushing children down toilets, and secret underground tunnels where rituals were carried out. In fact, many people took things into their own hands and tried digging around the daycare to uncover these tunnels, end quote. Despite these unsubstantiated claims, the allegations against the employees of McMartin Preschool ended up causing widespread hysteria.
The truth about Satanism is they truly do use blood, and they mix it with urine, and then they also use the real meat, the real flesh. This is what makes Satanism true.
Across the United States, many daycare workers and even parents were imprisoned after being falsely accused of child sexual abuse. It was exacerbated by unqualified psychologists who found evidence of children being sexually abused, even though there wasn't any. The subsequent trial was one of the costliest and most controversial in American history, running from 1984 to 1990, when all charges were dropped. The ritualistic sexual abuse allegedly being carried out at preschools and daycares across the United States is often attributed to 2 books, Michelle Remembers and Satan's Underground. The former, which was written by Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Padzer, featured the use of the recovered memory therapy on a patient named Michelle Smith, who recalled witnessing satanic rituals when she was only 5 years old. According to her, these had been performed by her mother, Virginia Proby, who she claimed was part of a satanic cult. The book was eventually debunked and discredited. However, it was too late. The belief that satanic rituals were regularly taking place had already spread across North America. Meanwhile, Satan's Underground was written by Lawrence Stratford, who claimed to have been held captive by a satanic cult, which forced her to perform horrific rituals that involved sexual abuse and torture. In her book, she wrote that her strong faith in God was the only reason she survived. Much like Michelle Remembers, Satan's Underground was later debunked, with Stratford being revealed as a con woman with a long history of mental illness. But again, it was too late. It had already exacerbated the public's fear of cults and satanic rituals. Dungeons and Dragons may not have been the only trigger behind the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. However, it was certainly a very popular punching bag, which ironically enough resulted in its demonization by countless religious organizations. Devout Americans blamed everything on the fantasy role-playing game, from teenagers committing suicides to the erasure of good morals and the traditional nuclear family.
For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel, coming from the Dungeons and Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body, and he's never come back.
Tactical Studies Rules, the company distributing Dungeons and Dragons at the time, did try to fight back against its association with cults, the occult, and satanic rituals. For instance, they hired a man named Frank Mintzer, who described his role as, quote, being a public spokesman. Thus, I was equipped with the right insider knowledge and set out to do battle. I ended up on Good Morning California in '81, right around Halloween, which made for an interesting show. I went head-to-head on the front lines with Dr. Tom Radecki and various other detractors of that era." End quote. Dr. Radecki was among those who testified in the trial of 19-year-old Darren Lee Molitor, who strangled to death 18-year-old Mary Towie in April 1984. Molitor claimed that Dungeons and Dragons played a critical role in his crime, saying, quote, "The reason I brought the game into the defense was not the evil aspect of it, but the way the game is played, the mind use. There is proof and evidence, in fact, that anything done within that aspect of role-playing is effective and is dangerous." End quote. During his trial, Molitor had testified that he and his accomplice Ronald Adcox had only intended to play with their victim's mind. This led them to bind her and wrap an athletic bandage around her throat, which unfortunately had tragic consequences. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. On a side note, Tom Radecki was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2016 when it was found he was using a program he ran called Doctors and Lawyers for a Drug-Free Youth to, amongst other things, trade substances such as Subutex, Adderall, and Ritalin for sex. Back to the 80s, and D&D was coming under increasing pressure, with many news outlets focusing on its use of magic. Before joining, Frank Mintzer was a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons, who eventually began working for TSR as an editor before working his way up to creative director. However, during the panic, he was in charge of addressing many of the criticisms, and for him, they all stemmed from the mistaken belief that Dungeons and Dragons wasn't fictional. He once told reporters, quote, "One of the common misconceptions, for example, that came up very often was, you cast spells in this game. People outside the hobby were taking the fiction literally and thinking that the spells were real. I would demonstrate on TV how to cast the spells and say, okay, I cast Fireball. And the host would look at me and say, what? I said, that's it. The same as I picked up a wrench. It is a tool, not ornate. It's just a tool in this fantasy milieu, and the only people who have a problem with it are those who believe these fantasy escapist elements take you away from reality." End quote. While Frank was specifically sent out to fight fires, often others who worked TSR would find themselves doing likewise. James Lauder was a writer and editor who worked in the fiction department. Despite his work being largely internal, he'd still find himself answering calls from angry and panicked people. Lauder recalled receiving a call from, quote, a father who was very upset that his son was playing D&D. He didn't understand the game and had only heard the sensational claims made by the panic mongers. He was, he explained, very religious. I talked a lot about the idea of shared storytelling and explained that I had played for years and had only positive experiences. I talked about the moral component of role-playing a bit too, mentioning the paladin class of RPGs such as Pendragon that foregrounded specific moral codes. He felt much better by the time the call ended and was going to talk with his kid about the game, so he could share his concern in a less frantic fashion." End quote. Apart from hiring employees to try and combat the media's sensationalizing, Tactical Studies Rules also decided to remove all demonic references in the second edition of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rulebook, which was published in 1989. However, these were all reintroduced in 2000 when the game's third edition was released. The company's efforts, combined with changes in society and the public's perception of the game, meant that the Satanic Panic of the 1980s slowly died down throughout the next decade. However, that doesn't mean that the hysteria surrounding the game is completely gone. For instance, in 2010, the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit upheld a ban on Dungeons & Dragons that had been implemented by the Waupun Correctional Institute in Wisconsin due to the authorities fearing that its books and character sheets could promote gang violence. One prison official even said that the game could, quote, foster an inmate's obsession with escaping from the real-life correctional environment, fostering hostility, violence, and escape behavior. End quote. Despite his views, some schools now use Dungeons & Dragons as a tool for promoting teamwork and social skills among students. And now the hysteria has died down, the general Christian view on Dungeons & Dragons seems much more level-headed. Elizabeth Garn is a D&D fan and writer for the website christandpopculture.com. In one article, she states, quote, "As believers, we are storytellers. We know and love the God who created stories in the first place and who has imprinted the greatest story of all time on our heart. Dungeons & Dragons may be just a game, a hobby, but it is also an amazing way to live out that storyteller, relational, truth-seeking part of our hearts." End quote. This is certainly a far cry from how it was perceived back in the 1980s.
Dr. Gary North says, Dungeons & Dragons is the most effectively, most magnificently packaged, most profitably marketed, the most thoroughly researched introduction to the occult in man's recorded history.
Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.